Thank you, Duncan, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank the Western Down Regional Council in conjunction with the UAV Challenge and the Department of State and Regional Development for sponsoring the Dalby Drone Industry Forum and giving us the opportunity to present. The focus of this presentation is to acknowledge the growth industry that is remotely piloted aircraft, UAVs, or commonly referred to as drones, and touch on some of the challenges faced by both CASA and the RPA industry, and to give some insight into the future of RPA operations and their regulation. A place to start is the terminology that's been adopted by CASA to describe these aircraft. CASA has determined that the best way forward is to use the term remotely piloted aircraft, or RPA. This is reflective of the acknowledgement that these are aircraft, much the same way as a Piper, a Cessna, or a Boeing, but that they differ in the fact that they don't have a pilot on board. Now, this is a fundamental shift in how these operations are viewed. This acknowledgement highlights the importance of these aircraft in the future and the future growth of aviation both within Australia and around the globe. Aviation, being a dynamic environment, both internationally and domestically, ensures that there's always a number of challenges for CASA and the aviation industry at large. While these challenges vary, both the industry and the regulator need to ensure that the safety-related matters are well considered and prioritised appropriately. Whilst acknowledging the services that can be provided with the use of an RPA, the consideration for safety outcomes at the forefront of all CASA's decisions. Both CASA and the aviation industry, whether they like it or not, are judged by these outcomes. If a certified operator using an RPA for life-saving patrols, for example, to ensure that sharks are quickly detected and swimmers alerted, there will be a positive public perception. But it won't be the same, however, if one gets sucked into the engineer takes of an Airbus on takeoff. Therefore, Australia's aviation regulator, we have an important role to play in setting the practical and effective regulation of RPA in Australia's airspace. The RPA sector has emerged as one of the most dynamic growth sectors in the world aerospace industry in this decade. So globally, civilian RPAs have become big business, superseding the defence market and now recognised as a dynamic change agent within all civil air operations. Between now and 2020, the RPAS sector is projected to grow between 200 to 500%. And it's expected that the sport and recreational sector will grow even more. But it's difficult to gauge exactly how many of those private RPAs will be flying in the future. In February 2012, there were 15 holders of UAV operator certificates in Australia and operating for commercial purposes. Currently, we have 766 approved operators and many more applications to process. So CASA anticipates that we'll have in excess of 1,000 approved operators by the end of this year. Whilst there's still a lot of growth in the small side of the RPAS sector, there's also a notable increase in the growth of medium RPAs wanting to undertake more complex operations. An example being the recently announced Westpac mini helicopter drone, the Little Ripper, that will act both as a shark spotter along the New South Wales coastline and a lifesaver in rescue missions in bush, snow and sea. These types of RPAs are often military-grade systems that are looking to the civilian world for new markets and new applications. Of significant concern is that the capabilities and technologies associated with RPAS are increasing faster than regulation reform can take place. So one challenge for CASA, as with most other national civil aviation regulators, is the extraordinary rate that these RPAs are appearing in the national airspace. With prices as low as $400, anyone can buy a small, high-performing, multi-rotor RPA equipped with high-definition live-stream video cameras, GPS, autopilot, with decent flight times, and pretty much off the shelf at any hobby store, and can be flying within an hour or two of that purchase. Not only will the size of the sector grow, but so too will the complexity and the diversity of the airframes and aerial activities being engaged in. So future-proofing regulations may not be as easy as it seems and will definitely be an ongoing issue. Some of the key challenges for CASA in the RPA sector will be the substitution of RPAS for the conventional and emerging aerial work tasks, such as mapping, surveying, surveillance and such. Another will be the complete integration into airspace with issues that we traditionally see in the see and avoid principles side of things. Carriage of cargo by RPAS, and eventually the carriage of passengers, such as the EHang 184 air taxi. So prior to these activities becoming mainstream operations, standards and regulation must be developed along with effective guidance material, and that often involves a fair degree of collaboration with all of the stakeholders that are likely to be affected by those proposed regulations. While the indisputable focus needs to be on aviation safety, CASA must be responsive in its attempt to proceed without inhibiting the growth or potential of this rapidly growing sector. Balancing these principles will present a sizable challenge to CASA in the future. So just quickly, we just recap on some of the types of RPA operations that we see in Australian airspace right now. From a sport and recreational operations, which is generally what we see for those who are conducting the sport for the sheer pleasure and the challenge of model aircraft operations. So those operations can be conducted directly under the regulations or through a self-administering organisation. The next is commercial operations. So those operations can be such as operations under a CASA-approved unmanned operator certificate, or after the 29th of September, there will be other options relating to excluded category operations, which we'll discuss a little bit later in the presentation. And then, of course, the third lot that we see at the moment is military operations, and that predominantly relates to all things military and their application to secure those military objectives, supporting our national security. And all of these are not governed, obviously, by CASA. So we'll talk a little bit about CASA's role. CASA's primary role, obviously, is aviation safety, and it takes into consideration a large number of factors. Primary among these factors is the safety of the general public and persons not associated with the operation of the aircraft. The second is the safety of other airspace users, which, of course, these days with the expanding capability of the RPA sector, we're seeing more interaction and development. And the third is the safety of participants conducting the operation. Now, of course, this is less of an issue with the unmanned operations than it is for manned operations. But CASA also has a role in the development of regulation, and this we'll explore a little bit further. So CASA's engagement with the aviation community forms a significant part of our standards development and our educational, advisory and operational activities. We value the importance of maintaining a meaningful, collaborative and mutually respectful relationship within the aviation community, but for this to happen, we need an environment which we can all work together in a collaborative and cohesive manner. The idea is to engage with our stakeholders at the grassroots level to fully understand the underlying aviation safety issues and those associated problems faced by the aviation community, and ensure that CASA's responsibilities have been understood. And in fact, this forum and the ability to present here is one such opportunity. Development of the complete regulatory framework for RPA will be a lengthy effort. It's an evolutionary process, and with regulations being added or amended gradually. Our chief method of working with industry is through the UAS subcommittee, which consists of members of all the sectors of the industry and government agencies. So working groups are attached to the committee and provide advice on particular issues as needed. So I'd encourage you all to participate in these working groups to contribute towards better safety outcomes. And luckily enough, we have the current and former subcommittee chairs here today. So feel free to gather them and talk to them at the break to see how you can get involved. CASA is currently considering options under which proposed self-administering organisations regulations under CASA Part 149, where an industry organisation may hold an authorisation to perform limited RPAS entry-related control functions. So the avenue to promote sport administering or self-administering arrangements similar to that of the sport and rec sector are some examples of CASA's genuine approach to shape efficient and safe outcomes for the industry. So now we'll talk a little bit about what is not the role of CASA. So importantly, it should be noted that CASA regulates aviation safety. But there are a number of issues that are beyond CASA's role and remit. So privacy is one of these issues. Federally, privacy is the responsibility of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. And there are also various regulations governing privacy in each state. So copyright is another one of these areas, and I believe one of our other speakers will cover it in the forum a little bit later on. But intellectual property is a phrase used to describe the rights of creators to use and protect their work. So the following IP inventions, literacy, artistic works, computer programs, database, broadcast, film, sound recordings, and plant variety are all trademarks and designs are covered under this. So federally, this is the domain of the Department of Communication and the Arts, and you can find more information on their website or later in the presentations. While CASA is cognizant of these areas of important discussion, CASA's role in the context of aviation safety is our primary function. So at the moment, in relation to our current regulations, Australia was the first country in the world to regulate RPAs when it was published under Civil Aviation Regulation 101 in 2002, which, when drafted, dealt with the technologies at the time. Now, Part 101 presently treats both small and large RPAs, similarly allowing operations both within and outside of controlled airspace, with some additional requirements for large RPAs. But when the rules were drafted in 2002, it was assumed that all RPAs would be similar to the type used in military systems of the time. However, that's not proving to be the case these days with the advancement in our technology. So CASA has amended the Civil Aviation Regulations Part 101 Foxtrot for RPAs used in non-sport or recreational activities, so essentially commercial activities. The principal objective of updating the regulations is to make the regulations more relevant to the latest technology and to enable a wider range of routine operational activities, while being cognizant of the red tape reduction initiative from the wider government. These amendments are due to commence Thursday, the 29th of September. So for more detailed information, you can see any of the handouts on your tables in front of you, or you can speak to us outside at the CASA table. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll talk a little bit about the proposed regulatory framework. And while there's still work that needs to be done on the regulations, CASA is in the process of identifying the risks associated with the different levels of weight and speed of RPAs. And that's based on their potential to harm people on the ground, damage other property, and of course damage other aircraft, so similar to bird strike type operations. So it's proposed that RPAs will be divided into groups categorised by their weight, and so far as the work that we have already conducted leads us to believe that RPAs above a certain weight and under certain operating conditions carry out a heightened level of risk and therefore require CASA approval for those operations. So RPA that are very small, for example less than 2 kilos, would not require an approval from CASA when operated under some strict, limited operating conditions. So, but RPAS or RPAs undertaking more complex operations will attract more stringent controls and will face greater scrutiny. So for example, Scan Eagle weighs about 20 kilos and is capable of flying to New Zealand. Therefore, in the interest of the safety of third parties and other airspace users, it's prudent that those operators to be licensed and have full risk assessment and that of their operation, and to be treated like more conventionally based piloted aircraft. CASA is also considering the pilot training standards for beyond visual line of sight operations, and that'll be included in the manual of standards for 101. And we're identifying those proficiency standards for operators of those more complex operations, such as the beyond visual line of sight. So in terms of the amended regulatory framework, we'll talk a little bit about what's new. And I guess one of the biggest things is getting across some of the new terminology. Obviously, we're using the term RPA, and the term REPL, or Remote Pilot License, is now being used and features in the new regulations. The second is the REOC, which is the RPA Operator Certificate. So there are new weight categorisations with RPA and coming out in the new regulations. So the first of these is micro. So essentially RPAs weighing less than 100 grams. Very small is the next category, and it is somewhere between 100 grams and less than 2 kilos. So therefore, a small categorised RPA will be from 2 kilos up to 25 kilos, with medium being between 25 and 150 kilos, and large obviously being more than 150 kilos. These amendments also introduced a new concept, which is excluded RPA. Now this relates to the commercial or private use of an RPA that's very small, weighing less than 2 kilos, that will not require any licensing or approval from CASA for certain circumstances and operations. There is a requirement, however, that that operator will have an ARN and to inform CASA in writing of the geographical area in which they'll be conducting those commercial operations. Additional restrictions are also contained within the standard operating conditions featured in the new regulations, and they'll ensure those operations are performed by this excluded category, and they will not be in a position to present any increased risk to people, property, or other aircraft. So a little bit more about these standard operating conditions. So these conditions are designed to minimise the risk of operations by the RPA remaining within visual line of sight at all times, not operating higher than 400 feet above ground level, so the risk of adverse interactions with other airspace users is avoided or at least limited, and operated during daylight conditions and at a distance greater than 30 metres from people. And additional to that is that they're not operated in prohibited or restricted area, or RA3 restricted areas. And further to that, that they're also not operated in an RA1 or RA2 restricted area without permission from CASA, not over populous areas, and not within 5.5 kilometres of a controlled aerodrome or 3 nautical miles in the old scale, and most importantly, not within or near a public safety operation such as bushfires or emergency services. And of course, only meaning that one RPA can be flown by one RPA pilot at one time. So we'll talk a little bit about 101.237, which is the new regulation that's coming out. So this new regulation outlines what an excluded category operations and requires. This is where you'll find information that is required to determine whether or not you may operate in the excluded category and therefore may not require to have an RPL or an REOC. This new regulation was introduced to provide greater flexibility for the rural applications of RPAs in areas where there's significantly less risk to other airspace users, persons on the ground, and when it's utilised by an operator or owner of the RPA on their own land. And some of those purposes essentially are for aerial spotting, aerial photography, agricultural operations, aerial communications and retransmission, and also the carriage of cargo or similar activities to those discussed. But I guess one of the highlights that we look at is the integration of RPAS into airspace. The use of these systems will continue to expand as technology and performance characteristics become better understood. Improved long-range flights or long-duration flights, covert operational capabilities and reduced operational costs are natural benefits to many communities such as law enforcement, agriculture and environmental sectors. Any significant expansion will also depend upon the development and certification of technologies required to enable the safe and seamless integration of RPA into all classes of airspace. These technologies are specifically those that relate to the RPA's ability to sense and avoid and to communicate with other aircraft and air traffic control. CASA envisages that the demand of small RPA flying beyond visual line of sight for a variety of purposes such as law enforcement, survey work and aerial photography and video will continue to grow. The larger and more complex RPA will be able to undertake more challenging tasks in the future, most likely to begin to operate within controlled airspace where all traffic is known and where ATC is able to provide separation from other traffic. So the integration of RPAs could conceivably lead to routine manned commercial cargo flights into Australia And in the low end of the market, the low weight, low volume parcel forwarding industry could be revolutionised by such technology. CASA expects that by 2030 it'll become commonplace to be able to look up and see unmanned aircraft flying overhead en route to a delivery. But it is anticipated by 2030 that if not before, UAS will be completely integrated into airspace as we know it today and interact with other airspace users in a similar manner to how we know manned aircraft operate today. RPAs will be common sight below 400 feet above ground and used for surveillance, freight, delivery services, as well as the maintenance of infrastructure. Currently, the requests for beyond visual line of sight approvals are increasing in frequency and complexity to CASA. Solutions to enable flight in controlled and non-controlled airspace is what they're requiring. So these are being dealt with on a case-by-case basis by our RPAS unit with the assistance of the Office of Airspace Regulation, who establish danger and restricted areas when required. While CASA doesn't have clear regulation in support of beyond visual line of sight operations at this point in time, and more specifically, the airworthiness standards that go along with it, CASA is still able to support the RPAS industry in developing RPAS operations. The key limitations on the broader use of RPAS is the lack of airworthiness standards and the lack of information on reliable and high-performing sense and avoid systems that are an emerging technology. There is also currently a lack of aircraft system reliability data, which includes that relating to fail-safe mechanisms and systems, and the lack of robust standards for aircraft communication, navigation, surveillance, telemetry, and the need to meet current performance standards for an onboard equipment, much of which at the moment is too large and heavy to be easily integrated into current RPAS. Many of these are technological issues that can only be resolved through international efforts and technology development. So in relation to CASA's functions supporting aviation safety, CASA should engage, and in some particular cases, where appropriate, fairly and proportionally conduct enforcement. In keeping with this broad framework, CASA has made significant progress in developing safety communication and the strategy focusing on the safe practices while flying RPAs to minimise risk to other airspace users and to those persons on the ground. The aim of this communication strategy is to reduce the number of recorded RPA aviation occurrences and to prevent serious accidents involving those RPAs. So the primary target of those, or the primary target audiences are sport and recreational RPA operators, UOC holders and new RPA operators. Secondary audience are manned aircraft operators, general aviation pilots, police forces, local government, firefighters and electronics and hobby store retailers. While we continue our communication activity in line with the introduction of these amended RPA regulations, it's really going to include ongoing work of explaining these rules in plain English, and as opposed to referring people to regulations for their own determination. The advertising material includes video material, social media activity such as Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn and YouTube, as well as traditional print, revised CASA website, content and advising in niche publications. So CASA is also in the process of developing a mobile application for RPA flyers, which will have interactive maps to show controlled airspace, helicopter landing areas, and a number of other things in an effort to identify safe places to operate. So the Can I Fly Here app will provide enhanced information to allow both commercial and sport, as well as recreational RPA operators, to determine the particular requirements for the flight on relevant airspace, their proximity to restricted areas, aerodromes both controlled and non-controlled, and linking to regulations in educational material. So CASA is expected to launch this app in the first quarter of next year. For any and all further information, please go to the CASA website at www.casa.gov.au/RPA. There's a wealth of information and it's our primary means of distributing information relating to this sector. So in summary, there's quite a lot happening within the RPA sector, as we all know, and there are quite a lot happening in many of these elements. One of the key elements that we'd like, from CASA's perspective, for you to take away today is to feel that if you need information, please contact us. We're more than happy to talk and discuss and essentially take on board any questions that you might have. Now, we have a stand here for today, and any information that you might require, please come and see us at the stand, because we're more than happy to have a chat. Thank you all very much for your patience today in listening to this presentation, and I'd like to thank you all for attending. And if there's any further questions, you can please come and see us after the presentations. Thank you very much.